Hello, this is Jeff Badge of the Grinding Doc, and I am continuing my series on the great grinding papers, the great papers of the late great grinding expert researcher, Stephen Malkin. And so this is paper number 4. We're not doing them in any particular order. It doesn't mean it's the 4th best paper. It's just we're doing it number 4. If you want to know the criteria I use for the papers and why I did a little bit of background about Malkin, his history, how he has his own Wikipedia page, go to the first video where I describe it. And here we're going to get into video number 4, paper number 4. And I've broken paper number 4 into 2 parts. It's really his work on electroplated, and they're two papers. And what I'm doing is just saying, hey, here are the 2 papers put into one, because he had enough good material to get 2 papers. Heck, he probably could have gotten 5 papers out of it if he wanted to. And so I'm going to run through what those papers are and what they're about. And so this investigation of grinding with electroplated CBN wheels. And one of the previous ones was his work on bonded abrasives. Bonded and plated behave vastly differently. And he did this with She, and this is when he was at UMass Amherst. And we go through electroplated wheels. But Malkin, being the smart guy that he is, he was thorough. And he didn't just give us a bunch of experimental results and say, hey, here they are, which would have been okay. A lot of papers are like that. I've written papers like that. I like to stick to first principles. I try to do that, but sometimes it's not always possible. But Malkin typically went back to first principles. Okay, so let's walk through the paper, or the 2 papers. Here we've got 3 different papers, A, B, C, 2 different wheels, A, B, C, and he measured the radial wear and the workpiece's grounds. And immediately there's a wealth of information here because we see, number 1, the break-in period. And I teach this in my grinding class where we get very, very rapid wear, where I call them the road grits breakout. And again, I'm going to run through it quickly here. This is not an educational course. This is just to talk about the great papers. If you want to know more about this, get the paper itself or get the book of grinding, where I walk through it and I take the pictures and I make them all colorful and pretty and nice. And then the other thing is he varied the parameters, and we can see that, okay, varying the parameters changes things a little bit, but not as much as you think. And that is a big conclusion, because you can grind with big aggressiveness, low aggressiveness, big chip thickness, small chip thickness. And for most wheels, that has a big effect on wheel wear. For plated wheels, it doesn't. So we've already learned a lot just in this one figure. And then Malkin measured grinding power as he would. He could have measured forces. He typically does that. Power is almost as good as forces, and here he does power, and we see how the power is increasing. But Malkin didn't just leave it at that. He gave us some reasons why. And then he gave us surface roughness, and he showed how that changes drastically, which is another of the important findings, and how we get a terrible surface finish at the beginning as the road grits bust out and as the cutting point density increased. You got wheel wear, attritious wear, and then Malkin looked at the number of grits per square millimeter. He looked at the cutting point density or the grain density, or sometimes he'll even look at both and he'll break it into cutting points versus grains. Looks at the wear flat area, maybe use the same gizmo he had when he did his Ph.D. to look at the wear flat area. And then this, very good stuff. What is the distribution of grit heights? That's what you got to do, because electroplated wheels are a different animal. Then he goes through and he looks at the grains per area, the cutting point density, or really the grain area. He shows how that changes over time. That's all part of first principles to explain to us what's happening during the process. Grinding power and how that's proportional to the wear flat area. And as wear flat area goes up, we get more rubbing energy. So fabulous paper, good stuff. And then he continued quickly after. I assume it was the same batch of tests he did with She. And now we're getting into, we have a nice SEM photo. I use this in the book of grinding. He gave me permission to use it before he passed away. I make it sound like he gave me permission on his deathbed. He didn't give me permission on his deathbed. A couple of years before, I said, hey, can I use that picture? And he said, sure. Here we have the aerial packing density and the grit diameter. Very, very good, useful stuff. Here we have the distribution of grit heights. Very good. All just basic stuff of understanding things from first principles. And then he shows grit pull out, the wear flat area. He gives us a nice little curve for what the equation is for the cutting point density or the grit density as a function of grit diameter. And when I was developing some of my programs, I used that formula. And then he gets into radial wear for different wheels and different parameters, as he should, and shows that, hey, you can grind fast and shallow, you can grind slow and deep, you can grind with different grit penetration depths. Doesn't affect wheel wear that much. And that's a question that I get during my courses. They say, hey, what can we do to reduce wheel wear in electroplated wheels? And it's not about changing your parameters, about other things, about cooling, about your grit selection, a lot of stuff like that. And I wouldn't have known that if it wasn't for Malkin's paper. I would have assumed, oh yeah, if you grind with a bigger grit penetration depth, you'll get more wheel wear, and that's just not really true, or not as true as it is in other types of grinding. And we have surface roughness and all the other stuff. Gives us a nice normal distribution here, it looks like. And all just solid stuff based on first principles. And then he took it a step further, and I believe what he did is he said, okay, that break-in period is it different for different grit sizes? And that's an important factor too, because all things being equal, big grits tend to give you a longer wheel life, but there are certain special cases with electroplated wheels where big grits can give you an incredibly short life if your criterion is holding radius. I've had customers save a lot of money when I explained that concept to them when their wheels were wearing away too quickly. Okay, go for a smaller grit. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it works. And he has a bunch of other stuff. G ratio, it's a little bit iffy to measure G ratio with plated wheels because you've only got one layer to go with, but it's reasonable. He did it. And then other stuff. Grain density versus surface roughness. Nice, good stuff. I think I've put this one in the book of grinding, and it shows doesn't matter what grit size you're using or what type of grinding, surface or cylindrical, you're going to get that curve that's going to line up independent of all those other factors. So this is Malkin's electroplated paper going to 2009. No, that's not right. That's maybe when I downloaded it. 2006. So one of the great papers by Stephen Malkin. This is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, talking about the world grinding guru, probably the greatest grinder to ever exist, Stephen Malkin, and his great grinding papers.